Hey, okay, we're back. So more on comics. So I have a big page of sketches here because I was testing out what ink I wanted to use, what brush. I decided on this one. So I want to kind of take a look at, oh yeah, look at all this. All my little doodles and tests. So I'm going to just clear that out. Okay, so here is the drawing. So this is page 1 of this chapter. And so here's what I settled on. It's something that's got a little thick to thin. It's got a nice crispiness to it. If I zoom in, you can see it's got actually quite a bit of tooth. It's got a lot of texture to it. So I think that's just gonna kind of create some nice, like a nice roughness here to these drawings that'll be a little bit lively. So that'll be cool. So again, you can go watch the custom brush videos if you want to look at making custom brushes and stuff like that. But anyway, this video is not about that. This video is about inking. So once I have the drawing how I like, and again, when I'm working on this stuff, I try to keep my layers. This was just like all that sketch stuff, right? So let's just dump that. I try to keep all my layers as simple as possible. So I have a draw layer and I have an ink layer. So I have the draw layer in blue so that when I draw over it with ink, it's really obvious. But I'm going to make it even more obvious. I'm going to take my draw layer and just kick it down in opacity. Doesn't matter exactly where. The point is that I want to make it really obvious where my ink is. And this is kind of like putting a piece of a sheet of paper, a sheet of tracing paper over top of that drawing, and and then it makes it even easier to see what you're drawing. Okay, so when it comes to inking, there's no hard and fast rules. You have to do what works for you. I'm doing digital inking. Inking by hand is much easier, but with all the scanning and stuff like that, you can just save time digitally. So there's something to say for either way. But either way, you gotta have the skills. So people pretend that there's this huge difference between digital art and traditional art, but there really isn't. I mean, most people that I know that work on one work on the other too. You just have sketchbooks and pencils and pens too. But the one cool thing about digital for me is that pens and paper and all this stuff are expensive. If you're getting 11 by 17 Bristol paper and all that stuff, and you're getting all these nice pens, like especially if you're buying Copic stuff, it gets real pricey. So I have those pens. I love those pens. I draw with them when I can. But I just love to just come in and work digitally too. It's pretty fun. So again, I'm on a Cintiq here, a Wacom Cintiq. So I do know it's a nice piece of equipment to work on for sure. I've worked on Intuos tablets and I've worked on pretty much everything. They all work. It doesn't matter what your equipment is. Although, if you have a mouse, that's going to be tough. get something. But, you can buy a tablet for like $30 nowadays. So no excuse not to have a tablet. So, all right. So he's drinking maybe it's a she. No, it's a he. It's a bug. So he's drinking the water and it's kind of like pouring out of his mouth here. So I just want to have that. And there's no rhyme or reason to kind of where I'm starting with this drawing because I'm inking it. I already dealt with the anatomy with my pencil sketch underneath. So all I'm doing is I'm thinking like, what looks good? At this point, this ink is going to be the final thing that people see. So this is when it does matter. In other videos, I harp a lot on like, doesn't matter right now, don't worry about anatomy and stuff like that. Don't worry about line quality and style because, you're planning or you're thinking about shot layout or you're, trying to figure out an animation. But in this case, once you do get to the final ink work, now you got to worry about it. So I like to get just, like little details and lines and stuff in there as well as like the big stuff. So that the drawings are just interesting. I like to use kind of pens that are rough or chunky or chiseled because if I'm working on paper in real life, I like to use I like to use papers that have more tooth and then can kind of catch the nib of the pen, and that gives it like a rough thing. Or I use brushes. I like to use fude pen, which are little, like the Japanese brush pens. I like to use, actual brush dipped in ink, and all those things kind of create more texture and tooth. So I like to add tools to my digital repertoire that are also toothy and kind of organic, and I like that kind of stuff. So that's the tool I go for. If you like stuff super clean, that's fine. There's people that ink in Illustrator and do vector inking, and honestly, there's something to say for that. There's some really cool things that you can do when you're inking in vector, like especially you can fix stuff very easily. You don't even have to be that good at drawing if you're patient enough. But I like to be good at drawing, and also there's just like a rawness to just working and not worrying about, like once you put a line down, oh, I can change where I put that line. It kind of puts you into this mode where you're always trying to like edit yourself and second guess yourself, which I personally am not a fan of. I like mistakes. I like the idea that, like, you put something down and, oh, that's how it is now. That's how you move on, because like you don't want to be working on the same page your whole life. You want to be working on the next page. So, mistakes are okay. And even in a final piece, it doesn't have to be completely perfect. The main reason that people like comics is story. So if the story's good and the drawings are good, but you have some splashy ink or some spatters somewhere, or this line didn't go exactly where you thought it was going to go, that's not really the end of the world, in my opinion. I think that's okay. Okay, and so I am going to just draw through the lines here, so you can see that I actually do my drawings before I worry about my panels. I do my panels last, and the panels the panels are the one thing where I might do that on a separate layer, just because it makes it easy. But I don't worry about, like, I don't want to draw my panel and then I'm like trying to draw the drawing exactly in the panel. Like, that's not how these things work. You can just crop this stuff later. So I'm going to just get in here and draw, and that's what's the most important thing. And so people work in different ways. Because I'm the inker and the penciler, I have a lot more leeway, because if I want to change something that I don't like in my pencil, like if I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm going to change that right now. I can do that without pissing anyone off. But if you're working in a team and something like that, and you're inking and you're trying to stay true to a pencil, you just have to be a little bit more careful with it. For me, I actually draw my pencils even loosely. So I do a sketch to lay out the shot, and that's super loose. And then I do a pencil on that, and that's still pretty loose. And then when I do my ink, that gives me the chance to take one last look at it and modify anything that I don't like how it feels. Not layout and stuff, but like of the drawing itself. So if an expression doesn't look quite right or whatever, I just change it. And if you are doing indie stuff, or if you're doing stuff that's your own project, you have that flexibility. You can change stuff, and no one's going to get mad at you. So that's cool. So I'm just going to add some details into here, and there we go. And the other cool thing about working digitally is you can zoom in as much as you want. So if you're not confident in your ability to draw a line that's this long, then you can just zoom in and do it. But the problem is, if I come in here too small, you'll get into this situation where you absolutely start missing the forest for the trees. So I tend not to do this very often, unless there's like a specific line that I'm like, dang it, I just can't nail that line. Then, and in that case, I might come in here and just so I can make sure that I hit that line well. But for the most part, I don't do that, because what ends up happening is you focus and you spend too much time, you waste too much time focusing on something that it seems like it matters because it's filling your literal whole screen here, but then when you zoom out and you look at like the whole drawing, it definitely didn't matter. It didn't matter a half an hour much. Like it didn't matter for like as much time as you probably wasted and put into it, like half an hour or something, right? And then it makes you kind of hyper focused on mistakes and stuff. And so basically, like even now, like I'm just gonna zoom out to almost what I would see in real life as like a 1-to-1. So this is in real life. I'm working at 11 by 17. That's what the size of the sheet is, just like I would in real life. On 11 and a half, or sorry, 11 by 17 sheet, and then you shrink it. So that's actually an old school comic trick. You work large, you do your ink work and your brush work and all that, and then you shrink it down 1.5 times, and then what that does is it makes everything look super sharp. Like, how did anyone draw that well? It's so clean and sharp, and it's because you just shrunk it down. So you basically shrink your mistakes, you shrink any line errors down to a point where like you don't see them as much, and that's just a trick. So you can cheat. People cheat. It works, and so I do that digitally. Even though it's digital, I shrink it down for the final size, which is 11 by 17, and then you shrink it down, and that is about 6 by 9 is what you end up aiming for, and a lot of things are published around that size, and there's a comic book industry trick for you. But yeah, so I do the same thing digitally. I shrink it down, so I don't want to work looking at it zoomed in too much, because it's just going to get me focusing on the wrong thing. Like if I had paper in real life, in order for me to zoom in, I would have to bust out a magnifying glass. And I don't work that way. I don't get out a magnifying glass, so I don't really want to do that to myself on the computer and give myself a digital magnifying glass, because then I'm going to work differently than I would if I was just on paper, analog styles. So I want to work the same way essentially. So yeah, so that's why I mostly work zoomed out all the way, but I will zoom in, like I mentioned, if there's a specific line that I'm trying to draw and I just can't nail it, and then I'll zoom in. So usually in inking, there's two kinds of inkers. There's pushers and pullers. So there's people that pull their line. That means you start and you drag the line, and they get their clean lines that way. And then there's people that push their line, which is the opposite. They start and push it out and flick their lines, and that's how they get their nice lines. And generally speaking, that's like people stick to that. If they're a pusher, they push. If they're a puller, they pull. I am admittedly not the world's best inker. I do kind of both. I do both, just based on the situation. So anyway, yeah. So inking's fun. It's a little bit tedious sometimes. I know watching people draw, for me, is usually way funner than watching people ink, because inking is so tedious. And also, it's just because when you ink, when you're drawing, you're like getting something new. So you're like, oh, what's going to happen? Like, oh, this blank piece of paper turned into this cool idea. But when you're inking, all you get is like the same thing that you had before, but cleaner. So you're like, oh, no, it's nice, I guess. So there we go. So this is definitely, inking really takes a lot of skill, but doesn't take a lot of imagination. So inking is kind of like the when it's the end of the day and you're super tired kind of activity. It's like the activity where you just zone out and do it. So this is actually a good one when you're like just sort of like, oh, I'm tired. It's a good time to do inking. If you're kind of energetic and feeling creative and all that stuff, that's when I like to sketch and draw and do layouts and stuff like that, because that's when my brain's sort of more active. Okay, that's good. Okay, now any final things, little details I want to add, little things where I could draw a butterfly or a cricket or something like that. Like, these are when you can just come in there and it wasn't in the original drawing, but in the inking phase, I can add just like a little bit of life. All right, so now I have this, and now the last thing I can do here is now I can create my panels. So I am going to create a new layer for that. We'll call it panels. All right, so there's panels. And then there's a bunch of easy ways to do panels. You can make selections and stroke them. You can grab a pen and just draw it, which is nice if you want like a nice organic look. Just hold shift in Photoshop while you're drawing and you can draw it. So if you want to do that, that's good. I do like to rule my panels this way sometimes because hand-drawn panel work is cool too. The only thing is though, I want it to be a little bit bigger. I might even use another pen. Usually I would use like a tech pen or something, but for now I'm just going to do this with the pen that I've already got. I like this hand-drawn look, and you can decide whether that's something you like or not. If you want it to be like just a clean panel, the other thing you can do is you can just, like I said, go to edit stroke selection after making a selection. I do like to do it this way though, because I think there's something cool about hand-drawn panels where it looks like I laid this out on paper, and especially for this comic, which is kind of a little bit raw. And you could even leave these little tips in there. I think that's actually kind of nice. And then it doesn't look as nearly as digicomic when you do that. So that's how I'm going to do it. Okay, and then, so this is on its own layer now. So now I can go to the ink, and anything that's sticking out like there and anything like here, I can just erase it, and it's very easy. So I just erase that, get rid of the drawing so I can really see. So erase that. And of course, the other thing you could do is you could just make a quick selection, and that makes it easy too. Just bam, go there, edit, clear, bomb. So that's easy. So that's why I don't worry too much about drawing exactly, because I know I'm just going to fix it later. So now I have my panel. In this case, this is like a big open one behind the panel, like a big open frame in here. So it's only one panel for this particular one. So let's zoom out and see if we like that. Is the panel too thick? Is it nice? It looks pretty good to me. So we've gone from our drawing to our ink. And let's see here, let's zoom in so you can see that. So we've gone from our drawing to our ink, and we've placed our panels. And now next we'll do color work, and I'll show you my tricks for flatting and stuff like that. So I know this was a little bit of a long one. Thanks for sticking with me and checking out how I handle my inking. If you have any questions, comments, or otherwise, like always, put them down below, and we'll take a look at them.
Yamsketch.